Splendid, thanks, Jess. And you've covered a fabulous array of territory there in a very thoughtful and logical and constructive way. If I may just ask you a question first, I love the idea about describing the cake. Now, I should probably ask you to describe the Wellington cake at this point rather than the Auckland cake. But if you're talking about Wellington as a wonderful place to live, how do you describe the Wellington cake?
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Sorry, I'll just say to Shambil and to Richard, if you'd like to do this too, how you would describe the Tamaki Makaurau cake, and I'll be in there as well with you on that one.
They get some time to prepare. Look, for me, the better Wellington that we live in it's about my kids being independent and then being able to get to where they need to go without me. For my oldest, she's 12 and she wants to be able to ride her bike everywhere. So she'll be able to set off from home and I'll know that she'll get where she needs to go and explore her city safely. I would say that it's even more of the wildlife and the bird life that we are so lucky to have in New Zealand. When I step out of my gate, it's going to be everywhere. I think that it's a Wellington where we have responded to the climate in a way that is really inclusive, and it ensures that we are operating in a way where we have shifted our economic system to really enhance our environment. We've got a lot of wind in Wellington. I feel like we could do more with it, Rob, to be honest. So I think it is really just more of what we've started, more of where we're heading, to be honest, in Wellington.
And if I may just jump in, just to give Shambil and Richard a few more minutes to think about this. For me, I start with location, because Tamaki Makaurau is this wonderful place on 2 or 3 harbours, depending whether you count the Kaipara in there, and these lovely ranges, the Honuas and the Waitakaris, and the incredible isthmus in the middle. And so to me, it is about the place, which is so beautiful, so delightful. And I just love cycling or walking to the top of any of the Maunga, any of the cones, to look around at that and imagine a city where there are 2 million or more of us living comfortably and having a lot of what we need quite closely to us. I'm very much drawn to the 15-minute city concept, but also then being able to get around very easily by whatever mode of transport we may choose, but particularly active transport and public transport, to avail ourselves of all the other things. But the city retains a great deal of that physical character of where it's located, but it's also helps us give a very distinctive expression of what an Aotearoa urbanism looks like. So we're not borrowing entirely from other places. We're giving expression to what it means to be urban people in Aotearoa. So anyway, that's me. Shambil, what do you reckon about your cake?
Look, like you, Rod, I love Auckland. It's a beautiful city, but it also has many problems. For me, the sort of 3 big ones are probably around congestion, unaffordable housing, and related to that, the lack of density. We have a city that's got a very tight, dense CBD and then very little density outside of it. A lot of what we achieved since the unitary plan has created density far away without the public transport and the transport corridors and the active modes of transport that we need. So really, I think if we want to make the best of what's possible in Auckland, there has to be this coordination and coherence in the way that we do things. There's lots of really great things happening in Auckland, but they're still fighting each other. And I think my dream is Auckland's got absolutely the potential to be this amazing city that it already is, but much better than this, but only if we coordinate those policies. So, you know, for many people like me who are relatively comfortable, Auckland is a beautiful city to live in, not much to complain about.
Richard, how do you describe the cake?
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit biased. I love Tamaki Makaurau, and I enjoy the cake, and I think the cake has a lot to offer, but I think, as Shamabeel said, not everyone in our city has the opportunity to enjoy the cake or have access or to be able to connect with, I'm going to stop saying the cake, connect with each other in the same way. That it is clear the policies enacted over 30, 40 years and still are happening, admittedly, are divisive to a lot of people. And I think a lot of the city doesn't realize that those decisions that have been made are divisive, potentially, if you aren't realizing that not everyone has the same access to the city or the museum or the zoo, or the beaches and the parks. You know, the where I grew up, we've got the highest urban tree canopy in the whole city, and I probably grew up thinking that was fairly normal, that I could walk to school safely under the shade of trees. And we know, you know, compared to Kaipatiki, Glenfield, Birkenhead, Northcote, with 30-ish% urban tree canopy, and you go to some of the local boards in the south who are 6, 7, 8, 9%, with very little public transport. And to have the heat and the dust and the lack of shade for those kids is completely unfair, and our city has been built like that. And whether it's definitely not accidental, but we need to address it quickly, but try and bring everyone along with us. So I'm proud of the city. I think there's so much to offer, but we have not built this city to make sure everyone feels that way. I think there's promise and there's hope, but it's not currently like that now.
Thank you. Before I get into some more detailed subjects, I'd like to keep pursuing some pretty high-level ones, if I may. So, Jess, your talk for us was very helpful in terms of those 6 shifts, and I'm painfully aware that I spent an awful lot of time as a journalist just believing if I could just lay out the facts, that would persuade people. So I was very much taken by your shift about to explanation, in which facts only play a role, but you use those facts to build a much more understandable and persuasive explanation. Could you give a particular example of where you've seen that good explanation actually have a big impact on changing people's minds?
Yeah, so sure. Put me under pressure. I think, you know, I do sympathize, right? I used to be a fact-led person as well. And it's not that we're saying that facts aren't important. You know, the work that we do, all of us do, I think we do it because we know that this is what research shows us. This is what people with lived experience tell us are the important transformations. You know, these are not based on whims or any kind of, you know, fairy tales. And so facts are still important. Where we see it's helpful is if there are existing mindsets in place and I guess probably the best one I can talk about is in the transport mode shift space, which is where we're doing work at the moment. And one of the challenges that we have is that the minute we start talking about, for example, in Wellington, I'll give you why we need to remove car parks or why we need to stop people from driving, you immediately get a reactive response. And the reason for that is because most people drive a car. And you're just basically telling them you're adding another problem. You're going to take away their car. Now, when we flip it and we start, instead of giving people facts, for example, you know, the city is growing, we often see that, and so we're going to need to remove cars, there's just not enough space. When we flip it to an explanation where we talk about how our cities were originally designed and how many people there were living there then and the types of lifestyles that we lived, and we explain that has changed, basically, that our population has changed, and we talk about the harm that it does to everybody, and then we talk about what the solution is in terms of mode shift and in terms of changing the way in which our cities are constructed. What we see is people are much more willing to consider the solutions that we put in front of them, because we've given them an explanation which doesn't rest in them feeling like A, they're a bad person, or B, something's going to be taken away from them.
Thank you. Shamabeel, do you have an example that you've come across where you've seen a very persuasive explanation of why something has been the way it has and how it needs to change, has actually moved a community or a group of people along in a useful way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think in Auckland, we had that wonderful conversation about housing and what needed to change. So the unitary plan, I think, was one step of that. So you might recall Selena and I wrote a book called Generation Rent. And a lot of it was one, having that, punch a little hook to sort of that imagery that, what are we creating? What are we losing? This kind of this almost this visceral sense that there is something of New Zealand that is being lost. And a lot of our work was really trying to describe how we got there. What was the reason? It wasn't because you were a bad person. It was because we had all these rules and regulations that over time accumulated into this incredible pressure. And then I think what we tried to show was there is a way forward. And it wasn't just us, right? There were a whole bunch of different people who were working in this space. And slowly the narrative shifted from house prices are going up, it's great, I'm rich, to house prices are going up, it's a problem, to going house prices are going up because we're not doing enough on planning, infrastructure, transport, all those other things that go together. So that evolution, I think, is really encouraging. When you wind back even 10 years, we were fighting about whether or not there was a housing crisis. Today, we have bipartisan support for what would be an extreme policy, which is MDRS, which is that medium density stuff. Extraordinary, right? To have bipartisan support on this extraordinary shift in public policy, I think is evidence of exactly what Jess was talking about. That we made a shift, understanding that there is a problem, that there is I think, a way to kind of emotionally engage with it. Know that it's not your individual fault, but there was a whole bunch of reasons why it happened. I don't think the people needed to know exactly why it happened, but they needed to know that we roughly understood that there were things that were happening and that there is hope, that there are things we can do, that it's not going to make everybody terribly worse off. So I don't know, that to me is a really good example of this incredible change that New Zealand has made in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very struck as I'm around and about the city, how rapidly multi-story, multi-unit housing is developing, whether it be small blocks of flats or rows of townhouses and the rest. And I think that's a huge change. Do you think that transport has kept up with that, or are we starting to put so much density in some places with inadequate transport, yet still that would serve that better?
No, I don't think transport has kept pace. Transport, I think, has not been coordinated enough. And also the unitary plan wasn't perfect. Like I said at the beginning, a lot of the new housing, a lot of the new density has come, won't be perfect. And quite often they're not well designed, and quite often they're too far away. We're creating density that's really far away and too far from nodes. It doesn't mean we don't want those houses. It just means that actually there is a different sequence that we might have had. Maybe Grey Lynn should have been densified first, and Ponsonby and those other places, and the golf courses in Remuera, rather than going out to far out to the west or far to the south where it was easy. So look, there's a lack of coordination and coherence in the way that we do things. And it's partly because council only was able to do the unitary plan. It was not able to also fund all of the infrastructure, all of the transport, and all of those other things, because there's so many silos trying to work together. Jess is kind of smiling in the background because she knows exactly how hard it is to coordinate all the arms of government together to deliver this. But I don't think we should try and fix everything in one go. It's okay to get a win and build on it. It's a cumulative, relentless journey.
Yeah, I've got a very particular question here from William about medium density. Will single house zone become MDRS, medium density? In other words, will there be no such thing anymore as a single house zone?
That is the intent, and about bloody time.
Right. Thank you. Now, in terms of how we are first of all, I certainly agree we can't do everything at once. It's a question of continuing to build, but hopefully in better lockstep. Do you think we've now got better coordination between central government and Auckland over the likes of transport and infrastructure that will now enable us to make a better coordinated response?
So were you asking me, Rod?
Yeah.
Look, the reason I asked is because I don't know the answer. I've seen lots of changes that they're trying to make, but we know that organizations like Auckland Transport don't have enough capital to be able to do everything it's being asked of. We know that there are big challenges in terms of the way that organizations are set up. Councillor Hills might be better placed to kind of tell us a little bit about what he's saying in terms of the coordination between central and local government.
Yes, Richard, it's wonderful to have you as an impromptu panel member. So, and you're the person who knows far more about this than the rest of us. So I was wondering what your sense was of how much better we are at trying to bring all the key ingredients together and coordinate them.
Yes, I was discussing this today at the future of local government. You know, in a perfect world, my perfect world would be that we'd have, say, 4-year terms with central and local government having their elections in the same year, maybe not the same month, maybe April, November. So then you had 3 solid years or 2 solid years if it was still a 3-year term of delivery together. The problem I feel we have at the moment is you have 1 solid year, then a council election where everyone gets scared or nervous and starts arguing about infrastructure, and then you have a year the next year where the central government election happen, and they sort of blame council for everything, and council blames government for everything, and then you come back together for a year to deliver. Then if the government changes, you have projects thrown in and out, and then you have the arguments about and then business cases and re-business cases, and then you end up coming to oddly often the same position you were maybe 3 years before all the you know, ups and downs. So I think there's a concern there with the politics. On actually working together, we have ATAP now, so the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, originally with the national government and Auckland Council and Auckland Transport in 2016, and that has gone on with the current government as well. And it's actually that's one of the better things. Obviously, in my opinion, it hasn't scratched the surface of climate and really driving the change we need. But at least I think in 2016, we had a $26 billion budget with government and only 20 billion was funded. Now we're up to something like 32 billion and it's all funded. So it's completely funded and we know what we're doing with Whakatahi, and we can sit alongside, and it's a zipped kind of capital budget as opposed to before where it was their budget, our budget, and everyone argued. So there are things like that, but there are also other issues which happen under, you know, the special housing areas under the last government and other housing by the current government that is sprawl with no plan for funding that infrastructure, especially water and transport. So we get kind of pushed to accept private plan changes or other changes, but with no way to fund that infrastructure. So there are, I think it's moved forward positively, but there's still an expectation that we can find the money on a much, much smaller base than, say, the government's budget.
Thank you. We've got some terrific questions coming through, and I'm just still trying to build a bit of a platform or a bit of a base before we get to them. And so the next question I'd like to ask you, Jess, is to use 2 words you haven't explicitly used in your presentation about the likes of deliberative democracy and participatory democracy, and whether we need to see whether some different structures, processes, cultures around how people do get involved would be helpful in moving mindsets and helping us deal with big complex issues.
Yeah, so I think, you know, when I showed the model of the kind of conditions of systems change, and I talked a little bit about the relationship and power dynamics, and I think there's a little bit of that in there, Rod, to be honest, is who makes the decision and who gets listened to. I think we've known for a long time that the way that consultation, especially in local government, but even in central government, works completely benefits listening to status quo people, powerful people, people with time on their hands, people with money, and people who can operate in the current systems. I think it's more than just about deliberative democracy. I think it's about rethinking how and who we want to hear from and engage with, because one of my concerns about kind of more Western models of deliberative democracy is that, again, you are shutting out people perhaps without time, money, or energy. I think about, for example, a mother living in South Auckland with a couple of jobs and no transport access. Well, how are you know, what are the systems you're going to put in place to make sure that you are actively and proactively involving her in a conversation? So I think, yes, more inclusion, but it's actually about not just inviting people to your table, but rethinking the entire table in which you create engagement and conversation and listening with, and that's about shifting power dynamics.
And can you give me a really concrete example of a shift in power dynamics you've actually seen that has brought about a big change? Sort of a concrete example of that.
I mean, look, I would say what's interesting to me is what's happened during COVID. And so we've done a little bit of work in the COVID space, and especially around vaccination. And one of the things we noticed early on was that there was a very much a top-down approach to COVID vaccination. Iwi and Hapu rightly so identified their exclusion from it. And it was actually through, I would say, a shift in the narrative and the stories that were told. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly has its problems, but there has been a shift in the power dynamics a little bit around iwi and Hapu being able to control some of the resources, and some of in the vaccination space especially.
Yeah, thank you. Shambi, was there anything you'd like to contribute on that question of different democratic processes and different ways to shift sort of power dynamics to be able to bring about a different kind of constructive conversation here?
Yeah, look, I think there's a relatively quick fix in that our councillors and council staff have the ability to make sure the information and the feedback that's presented is representative, right? So we know, for example, when the unitary plan happened, I keep going back to it because it was such a big thing for the council, but there was a very high weighting of submissions from lawyers living in Herne Bay. And so, you know, you don't want to give that equal weight to people, you know, future generations or people who are living in South Auckland. So making sure that the submissions are not presented on volume, but on true representation of our society would actually cut through a lot of the stuff that's happening at the moment, because it's very hard to see at the moment where these submissions are coming from, whose views they represent, and whether or not they truly are good for all of Auckland. And I think Jess mentioned one really important thing, well, many important things, but one thing that I think that doesn't get enough weight is the unheard voice of future generations. They don't have a seat at the table, but we all must take a collective approach to making sure we think about what's going to happen in 100 years' time. And, you know, Jess also talked about, you know, when our cities were first built, they were different, but also we have real good evidence in Auckland of our city builders, city leaders at the time who were thinking about our needs 100 years out, thinking about some of the water storage and dams that were built at the time, which was thinking about what Auckland will need in 100 years' time. So I think there is this requirement for us to be representative, truly representative, but a big weight, a chunk of weight on this must be future generations.
Yeah, and do you think that we can have a mindset with people currently involved for them to think in those terms, or do we explicitly need some kind of futures commission or sort of future generations body to represent that more directly and in a sort of a structured way?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. Jess might have a view, but my view is that we can't just pass it off to some group without power. So if we create something, they must have authority and an ability to influence the decisions that are made, not just somebody who's there as a tick box exercise, which is what happens, right? Or we consulted the poor people in XYZ, we consulted the young people, we consulted the rainbow community. Did it change your mind? No. Well, why the fuck did you bother?
Yeah. Jess.
Yeah, I mean, quite. So, well, I think there's a couple of things, which is, I think the values that we place at the heart of how we make decisions are actually quite helpful here. And I think there's a couple of things going on. You know, when you talk to a lot of local councillors and people, also people who work in local councils, they're very clear that they're making decisions and attempting to make decisions for long-term well-being and future generations. So I think, and they feel like they can't say that, or they're pressured not to say that. And I think, so that's an important thing to note, is that it does help when the people in decision making who are trying to make decisions for long-term future well-being talk about that, and that's why they're making the decisions that they are. I think the second thing that we need to think about is, as Shamabeel said, how do we actually empower those on the younger generation, for example, to be at the heart of decision making? That's about values. I think we use so many values in policy making that are absolutely implicit, and we say we're using one set of values and we're actually using another. So I think it's incredibly important to start making explicit the values which are driving and are being and we're basing decisions on, whether those are equity or long-term intergenerational equity or inclusion. Then give us the evidence that that's the decision that you've based those values around. I think there's an opportunity here to think much more deeply about honouring tatility, which is a blueprint for us thinking about the types of values that we should be using to make decisions for long-term well-being. Honouring the Māori intent of tatility is an opportunity for us as a country to drive forward with sets of values and decisions makings that really are about long-term intergenerational well-being.
Yeah, I'm with you all the way on that. And for me, one of the best practical examples of being able to get that long-term future thinking coming through from real people is the power of Generation Zero. I think they have been and continue to be very good at being able to express what needs to happen and how it can change what needs to be done, and to be able to argue very forcefully. I mean, it was they as a group who put the Zero Carbon Act on the table in about 2017. And then we finally got the legislation in 2019. So I'm a great believer in having, supporting people like that who can do that.
I think that's an important point, Rod. But the thing I would say is there is an injustice in that for young people to have to fight for essentially their well-being, unfunded in their own time, fighting against status quo individuals who are well paid, sitting in bureaucracy, covering their bums on status quo. And so I think there is an issue of resources here as well. Like, where is the money flows going, and are we putting them in the places for those young people, for example, to have the resources to do the work that they do, or for those people who are most hurt to be able to advocate and shift systems as well? So I think there is definitely an issue of, what are we doing? New Zealand doesn't have a particularly well-developed approach to civil society either. So our government doesn't do a lot of supporting, for example, of civil society groups and organizations that can actually support some more of this transformational shifts that are needed. So I think there's an aspect there that we could explore a little bit more as well.
Thank you. Here's a question about mindset change. And again, perhaps I'll offer this to you first, Jess, from Agnes, who says, mindset change takes a decade to come about, to change. Are there smart strategies to shorten this? Can it happen very quickly?
Yeah, so there's two things to say to that, and yes, it can be long, slow work, but what we see is that there are windows of opportunity that open, and what you want to be able to do is understand the mindset shift and the narrative shift in advance of those windows of opportunity opening. COVID was a perfect example where we could have taken an opportunity, and unfortunately, it didn't really happen. And partly that's because the existing work hadn't gone on around mindset and narrative shifts for a new system. Also because we lacked some of the capability and capacity to do the big shifts that we needed to make. The other thing that I would say is that mindset shift and structural shift doesn't have to be sequential. It can happen at the same time. So you can work hard on agitating for policy structures, system shifts, and at the same time work on mindset shifts. So if you have leaders who are looking like being brave and stepping into a space of making and advocating for change, you can do the mindset shift work at the same time.
Fine, thank you. And then I've got a good question here from Malika about how do we encourage grassroots, flaxroots work when so many people are time poor, financially unstable, and just need to pay the rent, get food on the table, and don't have the capacity to engage? So are there some ways to draw people like this in? And I'll come to you, Richard, too, on this one, if I may, from a council point of view.
It's the problem we consistently. Sorry, I've lost. It's the problem we consistently face at council, is that we do see similar groups of people being the same people who submit on the hundreds of consultations we have to do each year, and so you're constantly needing to take on board the views of those who give feedback, but then you need to also consider the future generations and the people who are currently living in Auckland who never give feedback, I guess. In my experience, that to make things enjoyable helps, to give people different options to engage. So expecting everyone to turn up at 8 p.m. in a drafty town hall, or during COVID times, a Zoom kind of meeting on the annual budget where we talk about rates for 2 hours is not the way to engage with people. If there is tangible ways to, we've done planting days before, or you've had a, design or placemaking group on a local issue or a local park or a local town centre, but then also been able to tag on other types of council initiatives for people to engage with at the time where they are, being at the library or the supermarket or something, and giving people the opportunity to placemake if they're interested. I think assuming people are going to come to council meetings, it's such in the past, that doesn't happen anymore. So providing more ways to engage where people want to be, but also you have to acknowledge that people are time poor, don't have the energy often to look through a 4,000 page annual plan or 10-year budget to engage. So you have to try and pick up what you hear through the communities and hope that people are engaging along the way. But there's no silver bullet to this, and this is a massive issue for cities and local communities, is the lack of engagement. Look at our voting record, 35, 38% each time.
Thank you. Jess or Chambil, do you want to contribute to that question about?
Yeah, it's interesting, because we recently had a conversation with people in Wellington about this, Richard, and one of the things that they said to us was they'd like to be consulted less, but they'd like to be asked about the things that matter to them most, and then be told later, why that decision was made, and which I thought was quite interesting. They really, it's not that people were disengaged in some sense, they just felt so over consulted, and then nothing happened. So this kind of regulatory environment of multiple consultations where nothing can happen, it's ticking the boxes, and people just feel worn out by it. And the things they were asked about didn't really have meaning for them. They would rather just say once a year, get to have a conversation about the things that mattered to them, and then say, you know, can you tell us why you did things? I mean, that's not going to keep everyone happy. I think there is a little bit of this engaging with the opposition going on as well. There's kind of bum covering in terms of, well, there's a loud, noisy vocal minority, and we're going to do all of these things in order to say that we met the need. And I tend to think, you know, we just need a little bit more bravery and clarity around who we're listening to, and going out and seeking input from those people. Like, there are children out there who love to be engaged on this stuff if there was the mechanisms to engage them and listen to them every day. You know, I do think we just need to get braver and be a little bit more innovative, and put some supporting structures around our governance that allows them to talk to different people in different ways.
Thank you. Now let me move on to some particular questions. Many of these are really big questions about the nature of what we're doing in the city. So this is a question from Dashko. Bearing in mind climate change is accelerating and at least partly irreversible, is it not risky to concentrate even more people and assets on an already hazardous volcanic isthmus, and thus make the city even more dependent on complex, centralized and vulnerable infrastructure? Would it not be safer to decentralize the infrastructure and disperse population and pursue a more polycentric spatial structure at a regional level? Richard, what's your sense about what's your response to that question?
Well, essentially, we've already done that, and it hasn't worked very well. We have a very, very spread out city, and it's full of people having to drive to the hospital, to the university, to the shops, to their grandparents' house across the city, to the interesting things in the city centre, etc. The infrastructure costs so much because it's spread so far apart. So I guess there's an argument with, you know, there's risk no matter what we do. We had extreme flooding during lockdown last year in northwestern Kumeu, where there isn't a lot of intensification. And then 3 weeks ago, we had 120 mils of water in 1 hour on the North Shore. And we had our streets, residents, libraries, everything flooded. And, you know, so that's quite a depressing view. But I guess no matter where you put the infrastructure, it needs to be resilient. And right now, we cannot build infrastructure for the types of weather we are having. So I guess my opinion, is probably not based on evidence, is that to try and continually spread out the city and think people stay in their local areas it just doesn't happen. So everyone will travel to the university somewhere, or to the football game somewhere, or to see their parents across the city, or kids across the city. So I think the more we have people connected in urban areas, the current urban areas, the more infrastructure we can build quicker for the people who live there, but also the less people need to travel vast distances. Much like almost every major city internationally in the world is how it's set up. So Shamaville might have some more data behind what I just talked about, but that's kind of my view, that I think it's a nice idea, but I don't think it actually works.
Well, I guess the only thing I might add is Auckland is polycentric in the sense that we do have multiple city centres already, and we have, when we talk about Auckland getting density, it's not necessarily only in the isthmus, only around the CBD. In fact, quite a lot of density that we want is around transport corridors and transport nodes. So I think that is where we're heading anyway, given the footprint that we have, which is a fairly widespread footprint now. The task for us is to make sure that we get some density around the corridors and the nodes that are there. So I think Dushko is quite well known for his views on this stuff, so we won't go too detailed into it.
Fine, thank you. There's several questions here that I'll paraphrase. And it gets to the heart of whether we are making sure that as we develop our built environment, we're doing the right thing there. So there's questions about urban stress and depression, because lots of high-rise buildings and lack of green space. There's another question, this one from Julie, about oh, sorry, it wasn't Julie, but another person here about trees and the like. So here's the question. Are we confident that the National Policy Statement on Urban Development will still allow us to have high standards and to make sure that what we build is built well and designed well? Or do we feel we're kind of heading for a bit of an open slather? Any?
Well, I can probably contribute a little bit. Look, think of the policy changes that we're seeing, including the NPSUD, MDRS, Auckland Unitary Plan. Think of them as a progression of things that we're trying to make better. So we are starting from a place that wasn't very good. So we clearly weren't creating enough homes that were sufficient for all Aucklanders or all New Zealanders. And we had the Unitary Plan, it wasn't perfect. We now have the NPSUD, which is essentially the Unitary Plan on steroids for more of New Zealand. And then we're getting the MDRS, which is essentially doing away with single family homes, home zones in fast growing parts of New Zealand. None of these are perfect, right? So even the RMA reform and all these things that are coming, this is all part of a continuation of trying to, one, build enough homes. But at the same time, I think we are going to see some niggles around transport, around things like green space. And this is why Auckland Council and most local government has pretty good policies in place of lots of green spaces in most neighborhoods, right? And I think we've got to make sure that we protect and preserve some of those things. So I guess, yes, we should be cautious that as we make these changes, there will be some unintended consequences, and we should make them better as they become evident over time. So we should not think of public policy and policy changes as static things, rather things that are alive and that are relentless. There is no end date. We should continuously be trying to improve, because we can't plan for and regulate for every eventuality. It's that 80-20 that Jess was talking about in many things, right? Get it there, and then we keep improving. So I might answer it in that way.
Fine, thank you. So Richard, how are you feeling about the National Policy Statement and the processes we have now, whether they are robust enough to make sure we design, build and run our built environment well?
I guess I still have worries about things like design and things, because even the current RMA won't protect that. And it's probably due to a cost thing, that if we require too much, the buildings never get built and they're far too expensive. So I can see the other side of that discussion. But I guess a lot of it is the misinformation. I see someone has a comment about the parking strategy the other week. Like that is about 3% of the roads across Auckland that will be consulted on when a project is put in place over the next 10 years. But it had a lot of other things around disability parking. Where do we put new EV parking? Where do we, how do we ensure we get turnover in our town centres? There was about 7 policies. All that got focused on was a little bit about having to remove some car parks on some streets at some future point. So much like that, the NPSUD, the worst bits will get thrown across the papers and make people very scared that their lots is going to be built around their house and they're going to feel like they have no power overnight, when largely that won't be true for most people. But I guess what it will do and what it has to do is provide more housing around town centres and our public transport routes, because the rates are finite and the taxes are finite, and we need to continue to build on what we have. The issue is when we keep sprawling, we have to continue to put up the rates and the other charges and inevitably taxes eventually to fund all the infrastructure. And then I imagine in 30 years' time, renewing, or 50 years' time, renewing that infrastructure, you're having to pay for it all again, which we're finding in parts of Auckland now. Look at our waterways, trying to fix 80-year-old pipes under the ground right now. So I guess there's no good argument for exactly the perfect model, but I think the government and I guess the opposition too, working together on this, has made it happen. There are issues that council is facing, and we don't know how we're going to pay for the infrastructure if it is kind of spread out. You know, we felt in some senses there was a lot happening with the unitary plan anyway, but we also have to make sure that people feel heard along the way, and we can understand why people feel upset at lots of change happening all at once. But we also have to think about the next generations and their ability to live in this city or stay in the community that their friends and family actually live, which at the moment I don't feel that's happening.
There's a very specific question here that we used to have an Auckland design office, which was doing good work, but that was disestablished. Don't we need, should we, well, the question is, should we reignite a city design office to be a real sort of creative center for good quality design? Let me ask Shamabil that in terms of what you're seeing around the city in terms of quality of design, and whether you feel a mechanism like that is essential.
Yeah, I think as long as the powers are very specifically defined, so it's about boundaries. So as long as it's about topologies, it's about protecting certain things. But, you know, we've also seen the overreach of councils and others of, you know, telling you what color your door must be. Well, you know, there's a balance in terms of how far we go. So, you know, the vandalism of the 80s, when we kind of did away with so much of our architectural and built heritage. And then, you know, we had no design controls and we built really ugly things. So yes, we need to find a balance. Something like a design office is a good idea, but as long as its powers are quite limited and defined.
Yeah, thanks. Jess, what's the situation in Wellington in terms of whether Wellington City Council has sort of a design office, you know, a central form?
Yeah, and the most recent consultation around urban density, that was feedback, and I know that the council was looking at that. And I mean, it certainly, look, with the bypass that went in, and a lot of the things that happened here in the 90s, where we had some dreadful developments in Upper Cuba Street and bisected the middle of, you know, a heritage area with a massive, you know, 3-lane essentially motorway, which I have to try and walk across each day, and makes me very angry. You know, people are naturally really, people who wouldn't hesitate to support urban density do feel quite concerned that that sort of thing has happened. And you know, for me, I get back to what are the values that drive a lot of these decisions. And I think when you think about equity, I think that's a really important thing to consider. So both, how do you do universal design, so you're inclusive of people into the future, thinking about environment, so how do you create spaces in which there's sufficient green space if you're going to build up, and also thinking about how do you create housing in which people are actually in warm, stable housing that will is carbon neutral, or at least has low energy requirements. So if you can center some of these values, you're probably going to be able to do a little bit better and think about some of these issues in a kind of more constructive way.
Thank you. There's a question here about media. Media scaremongering is a big contributor to mindsets, see cycleways, parking, intensification, etc., and are reinforcing the status quo. What's the responsibility of media in supporting necessary transformational change? Maybe a question for Rod, which was the person asked, which I'm very happy to answer. Media has a huge responsibility to do that very well. And we very often fail, quite honestly. Part of it is that media organizations don't have the resources they used to have because business models have become so stretched. But it's also partly a sense in many newsrooms that people's attention span is not necessarily up for big issues. And so far too often, you just see a noisy personal few people interviewed on a given issue. We're seeing it, for example, on parking now. And yet so the responsibility is absolutely there. So I would encourage everybody who feels strongly about this to express your views to media organizations where you feel that they have been deficient, that they haven't explained an issue well enough or given a wide enough range or given sort of fully both sides of the argument. And if you feel that the answers are still unsatisfactory, or you feel there's a particularly or better, this next response applies to this next situation. If you feel there's a particularly egregious example of that failure, then there's there are press bodies to make a formal complaint too. Some years ago, even though I'm a journalist, I made such a complaint about a media organisation that I had feel substantially failed on it was the time of the unitary plan discussion on a particular aspect of that. So yes, absolutely, the media is absolutely crucial and needs to be kept up to the mark on this. So I would be also welcome, of course, views from our panelists on that as well.
Well, I was going to ask you a question, Rod, which is like, there is certain criticism, for example, that local and central government shut down access to important experts when decisions are being made or particular policies are being made, and that can influence and affect, journalists' ability to both explain the issue and where it's coming from. How much do you think that is true?
Oh, it's very true. And it has got to be more of a challenge as time's gone on. So, for example, these days, it's actually very hard to get even to talk to people closely involved in an issue. And many of my colleagues are very frustrated by that. My response to that is to then take the very perfunctory statement from the media office of whatever ministry it was that has failed to supply and just quote that whole thing and saying, this is the only response I get. Now, that's not satisfactory. It's only making it clear that they've failed. What I really need to do as a journalist, and I do spend a lot of time doing this, is then trying to rather than taking a straightforward front door approach, and when the front door is completely closed, trying to find the right people to talk to, or at least the people who talk to those people, to try to understand what's going on and then try to give expression to that. That's very time consuming. And I do very much regret that's what it's taking these days. And the days when you could talk to, and that used to be one of the great joys of being a country this size, you felt that you could actually get hold of a minister or senior staff people who were directly involved in an issue. And that's very frustrating. And I'd love to, my colleagues and I are all trying to find ways to turn that around.
And I think it's really important, to be honest, people in government have to get used to the idea that they are going to have to explain their transformational policies and why they are doing them, as opposed to running scared of what will happen. And that's a relationship issue as much as anything, and is my impression.
Yeah, absolutely. Shambil, any sort of comment on that?
I kind of feel for a lot of the people who work inside of local council and in government departments. So there might be experts, but there's also such a risk aversion around not saying the wrong thing or not being exposed to these kinds of situations that it is very difficult for them to engage too. So our public service is kind of protected behind this wall of media and PR, and the experts are quite often, not always, quite often excluded. And I think that does make for a poor discussion, because it's easy to beat up on local government workers and on bureaucrats, but the reality is these are experts who are doing quite often really good work. And we're not seeing the full benefit of the evidence, the trade-offs, the tensions that politicians are dealing with. So quite often what we get is a very kind of neutered view of what, the complexity of the problems that we're trying to decide on. And I think that does make it very difficult. So reflecting on what Jess has been talking about, yes, we don't need to have every detail paraded in front of the media, in front of the public, but the public need to understand why there is a problem, that we understand the issues, and that there are ways of improving it. And I think we need to end on that note of hope, that we understand there is a problem, but there must be hope that we can do something, and that we can trust our elected officials and our experts in bureaucracies to be able to do this. Sometimes it feels like we're not making progress, but our country is getting better. Our city is getting better. It may not be getting as better as quickly as we'd like. So I think a lot of what I took from Jess today was, how do we speed this stuff up, and how do we get rid of a lot of the opposition that slows things down?
Yes, thank you. That's very well said. I was just about to wrap up, and that you've got us off to a very good start to wrap up there. So I turn to Jess to see if there's anything you'd like to say by way of a closing comment before I say something briefly and then hand over to Richard for thanks.
No, just thank you for having me. There were lots of great questions we didn't get to answer, but it's so nice to have so many people so enthusiastic and engaged. And as Shamabeel said, it's helpful to look for where change is happening when we're doing this work, to remain hopeful. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I want to stress about the title of this, Our Growing City, Understanding the Challenge of Change. And so that's why we had Jess as our main speaker, talking about those 6 shifts. So thank you very much for that considerable contribution. Rather than getting into many of the specifics about what's actually underway in the city. And so it has been a very rich conversation across those really important subjects. And that sense that the city is progressing in terms of the quality and attractiveness of what we're doing, and finally wrestling with some of our big issues. We had some 240 people online, so thank you all hugely for being a part of this, and to Ashley McIntyre in Auckland Council, who organises Auckland Conversations. So to Ashley and her colleagues, thank you very much for doing so and getting us involved in this evening's programme and staging this online. Speaking as a keen attender of Auckland Conversations, I look forward to them being back in person. That's always a treat. And so thank you very much for joining us and being part of the discussion. And I'm sorry that we've only been able to answer a small selection of all the great comments and questions you raised.